Jon Snow stood in the courtyard of Castle Black, the words of the Night's Watch vow reverberating in the frosty air around him. Somewhere deep inside, he felt an unsteady tremor coursing through his veins. This was the day he was to speak the ancient oath, to leave all that he had ever known behind and commit himself to the Black Cloth. His breath streamed before him in thin wisps of vapor, and the eyes of the brothers in training pressed on him, expectant. But there was a weight on his heart he could not name. He could not step forward. Samwell Tarly hovered at his elbow, anxiously waiting for Jon to move. PYP and Gren stood a few steps behind with their hands clutched together against the cold, their gazes flickering between the weirwood tree at the edge of the practice yard and Jon himself. None of them spoke yet, for they were all taught that the oath was a solemn moment. A man came forward as a boy and left it as a brother. The hush in the courtyard was all-consuming. Jon's eyes traveled across the faces of his soon-to-be sworn brothers, and he caught sight of Maester Aemon on the ramparts, his blind eyes glimmering with a curious wisdom. High above, the gray sky loomed, and crows circled. Jon's heart pounded. He remembered the old scars of unspoken shame. Bastard, Snow, the burden of never truly belonging to the house he loved. He had come here in the hopes that he would find a place of meaning and honor, that he might do something worthy in the realm. Yet as he stood on the cusp of the vow, the memory of his father's imprisonment, Lord Eddard Stark, the man who had raised him, the man he had long admired, jarred him awake. He had once believed that Ned Stark's capture in King's Landing could only mean that justice would follow, for how could it be otherwise? Lord Stark was the pillar of honor in the realm, the man who had taught Jon to be true to himself and the ways of the North. But the rumors carried by the blackbirds that arrived at Castle Black told a darker story. Treachery in the capital, a court turned hostile, and the possibility that Ned Stark might be executed for the alleged crime of treason. Jon's world had begun to spin out of control. Could he truly speak words that would bind him forever, never to avenge or protect his father? Something in him rebelled. He tried to quell that voice, telling himself he was doing his duty. The old gods watched from the heart tree, or so Jon had been told. But the old gods were silent, their red leaves drifting in the cold wind. He could imagine their presence in the north, at Winterfell, in the quiet grove where he'd prayed. Yet here he was, about to swear a vow that would make him powerless to help the very family he had always yearned to call his own. And something snapped. He opened his mouth, about to say the first words, "Hear my words," but they caught in his throat. He thought of Ned's gentle half-smile, of Robb's friendly jibes when they practiced swords together, of Arya's fierce admiration and Sansa's aloof courtesy. If Ned died, what of them? If the family name was being torn apart by rumor and lies, if the king in the south had turned traitor to the cause of justice, then was it truly right for Jon to remain on the wall, chained by oaths that forbade him to interfere? A tide of fear and longing crashed over him. The yard remained silent. Sam cast an anxious look around, as if expecting Jon to simply begin. But Jon found his voice. I cannot," he said softly. A restless murmur sprang up immediately among the onlookers. Ser Alliser Thorne, standing near the cold ramparts, pursed his lips in clear disgust. The old veteran's face twisted in frustration. "Speak the words, boy," he hissed, though he was careful not to speak too loudly in front of Lord Commander Mormont. "Don't make a fool of yourself." But Lord Commander Jeor Mormont stepped forward, brows knitted together, a spark of confusion in his eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Snow?" The weight in Jon's chest was heavier than any he'd known, but he held his ground, wrestling with shame, fear, and a flickering sense of resolve. He saw that Sam's round face had turned pale, and that PYP's mouth had fallen slightly open. The oath that they had studied for nights, the oath that PYP yearned to speak so he might finally belong to something greater than himself, was about to be abandoned by Jon. Jon felt he was betraying his friends, and yet, for the first time, he felt he might be standing in the light of something truer to himself. "I cannot speak the words," Jon repeated, forcing each syllable out. "I cannot give my life here when my father is in danger in King's Landing." The murmurs in the courtyard turned to exclamations. Brothers of the Watch looked at one another in shock, for it was unthinkable for any man to come this far and refuse his vow at the last moment. And Jon was supposed to be the best of them, the best swordsman, the best rider, a natural leader. Maester Aemon, high on the rampart, inclined his head thoughtfully. He did not look outraged, but rather pained, as if he understood how deep this conflict ran in Jon's heart. Before anyone could say more, Jon kept talking, because if he didn't say it now, the weight of what he was doing would crush him. Lord Commander, I wish no insult to the Night's Watch. I have the greatest respect for you and for the brothers who stand the wall. But my family, my father, I cannot turn my back on them. I swear I would have served here faithfully, but they need me now. Ser Alliser scoffed loudly. Just as I told you, he's only a boy playing at soldiers, not fit to be a black brother. Jeor Mormont turned on Ser Alliser with a glare that silenced him. Then the Lord Commander turned his gaze back to Jon. Many men of the Watch have families in danger across the realm, Mormont said in a low, steady voice, his breath swirling in the cold air. They learn to let go. The vow demands sacrifice. If every man left the Watch when his kin were in trouble, the wall would be empty. Jon swallowed. He thought of how he had once accepted that cost, believed wholeheartedly that the needs of the realm were greater. But that was before the sudden, savage realization that his father might lose his head, before he heard the frantic ravens carrying the news of Eddard Stark's accusations and King Joffrey's unpredictable nature. Perhaps a stronger or more duty-bound man would still have gone through with the vow. But Jon could not. It didn't matter if the entire realm hated him for it. He would not stand by while the father who raised him, whether by blood or name alone, was murdered by a treacherous king and court. I understand, Jon said, his voice hollow. But I will not say the words. Lord Commander Mormont studied Jon's eyes for a long moment. You realize what it means to turn your back on the Night's Watch, especially at this last moment. If you were sworn already, it would be desertion. As it is, you break a solemn promise to join. The best that can be said is that you were not sworn yet, so you are not yet a brother. But we brought you here under Ned Stark's blessing, did we not? This might look ill for him. Jon bowed his head. I am sorry. No more words came to him. He knew he was putting them all in a difficult position. Part of him wanted to fling himself at Mormont's feet and beg forgiveness. But a larger part of him stood resolute, steeled by the memory of Winterfell and the whispers of wolves in his dreams. Perhaps even the old gods were calling him back, refusing to let him bury himself in black robes while Ned Stark's life hung in the balance. Mormont sighed, the lines of age on his face deepening. You may go if that is your choice, but do not expect to find open arms where you travel. And do not expect that you will ever be welcomed here again if you are turned away now. The Night's Watch does not forget such insults. He turned to the men around him. Let it be known that Jon Snow, once a prospective brother, is free to leave, for he has not spoken his vow. No man here is to harm him, but from this day forward, this is no concern of ours. He is not a crow, not a friend, not an enemy. Let him do as he will. Jon tried to speak some words of gratitude, but all that emerged was a strangled, thank you. Then he swallowed hard and nodded. The men parted like a black tide, offering no warmth or fellowship. Sam's face was contorted with distress, and the heavy look in Pype's and Gren's eyes was almost too much to bear. Jon's head swam with shame and relief and terror of what lay ahead, yet a fierce determination burned in his chest. He gathered his things, hardly speaking a word, and walked through the heavy wooden gates of Castle Black. He was no deserter in the strictest sense, but he would carry the stigma of betrayal, for there would be rumors. He pressed the thought aside. Beyond the gates, the wind from the north slapped him like a welcome into a harsh land. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and Ghost padded beside him, bright-eyed and silent as ever. He knew that the road south was long, and winter was only creeping closer. But for the sake of his father and siblings, he would endure whatever hardships lay before him. Jon rode a borrowed horse for 3 days, traveling hard, skirting villages that might question him too closely or alert the watch about a strange traveler. He had no illusions that his departure was entirely free of potential consequences. Some black brothers might see him as a traitor, oath or no. Others might try to bring him back to Mormont. But he rode onward, the determination to reach Winterfell, or wherever Robb Stark might have led the northern armies, driving him. Each night, he pitched a small camp, with Ghost vigilantly keeping watch, and tried to shut out the creeping cold. The presence of his direwolf at least reminded him that he was, in some way, still connected to the blood of Winterfell. Bastard or no, he was Stark enough to have a wolf of his own. That thought gave him hope. On the fourth day, he encountered a small band of travelers headed south. They were merchants lugging a battered wagon. Their leader, a leathery-faced man named Hal, said they were going as far as the last hearth. Jon parted ways with them before he reached that hold, not wishing to be recognized by anyone loyal to House Umber who might wonder why a black-clad youth roamed free. Eventually, after a harsh journey of 2 weeks, Jon found himself at the edges of the lands belonging to Winterfell. Here, the pine forests were familiar, the roads quieter, except for the signs of conflict, tracks of horses, the occasional rumor of northern bannermen moving south. Everywhere he turned, he heard the name Robb Stark whispered in tones of respect and fear. The young wolf, they called him. Word had spread that upon hearing of Ned Stark's imprisonment, Robb had called the banners. The lords of the north had answered. War was brewing. Yet Winterfell itself was quiet when Jon arrived one gray morning, leaning forward in the saddle, exhausted, his cloak tattered and his cheeks raw from the cold. From afar, the ancient stronghold looked sturdy and bleak under a sky thick with clouds, the tall towers a comforting sight. Ghost trotted beside him, body taut with excitement at the familiar sense. Jon felt a pang in his chest at the sight of his old home, for though it had never truly been his by name, it was still the place he had been raised. Now he returned in a swirl of conflicting emotions, uncertain how he would be received. At the gates, a few guards recognized him instantly. They seemed uncertain whether to hail him as Lord Snow or some other title, but eventually one stammered, Jon Stark or Snow, or the bastard of Ned Stark returns. Jon dismounted slowly. He could see their eyes flicker to the direwolf at his side. "Open the gates," he said simply, his voice muffled by weariness. "I need to speak with whoever is in command." Inside, Winterfell felt emptier than Jon remembered. The main courtyard was not bustling as it used to be when Ned Stark commanded from the Great Hall. Instead, a skeletal crew of servants and guards managed the day-to-day tasks. Bran and Rickon, Jon's younger brothers, well, half-brothers, were still here if rumor held true. Robb had ridden south with a large host, and Lady Catelyn Stark, so the talk went, had gone to meet lords in the Riverlands. Jon was led to the Great Hall, where he found Maester Luwin seated at a long table, a small pile of correspondence and ravens perched behind him. The old Maester looked up with tired eyes, and for a moment, surprise lit his face. "Jon," he said, setting down the parchment. "You've returned." Jon inclined his head in respect. "I have, Maester, though I have not come from the Night's Watch as a sworn brother." He hesitated, expecting censure, but Maester Luwin's expression was one of understanding, tinted with sadness. "I received a raven some time back," Luwin said softly. "They noted that you had not taken your vows with your fellows. I suppose I ought not to be surprised that you have chosen another path." Jon let out a breath. "I had to come. For my father, for the family. I heard the rumors of the king in King's Landing, and the possibility that Lord Stark might face execution." "Where is everyone?" Maester Luwin gestured around. "Robb took the main host south to the Twins. He intends to cross into the Riverlands, to rally to your father's cause. News is dire. We have not heard a word of your father's condition for some time, other than that he remains in the black cells for treason." The Maester paused, as if trying to gauge Jon's reaction. "Lady Catelyn has gone as well, hoping to negotiate an alliance with the Lord of the Twins, Walder Frey." Jon clenched his fists. "Then I must go to them. I must do something to help." Luwin nodded. understanding the urgency in Jon's voice. Yet he reached out, gently placing a withered hand on Jon's forearm. "Your brothers here, Bran and Rickon, they need guidance, Jon. They are young, with Robb away. You might be the only one of the older Starks left in Winterfell. The castle is safe for the moment, but these are uncertain times." The mention of Bran and Rickon made Jon feel a fresh surge of guilt. He had not considered that, in leaving for the Watch, he had also left them behind. He wanted to ride south immediately to join Robb's army. But was it truly wise to abandon Winterfell, with war looming on the horizon? He looked at Maester Luwin, uncertain. "Could I see them?" he asked in a quiet voice. Maester Luwin's face softened. "Of course. They are likely in the Godswood or in their chambers. They will be overjoyed to see you." Jon felt a flutter of nerves in his chest. Ghost pressed against his leg as if to reassure him. When he found Bran and Rickon in the Godswood, his heart twisted at the sight of them. Bran sat by the edge of the black pool, legs folded beneath him, his face turned up toward the pale light filtering through the red leaves. Rickon, his wild hair tangled, was crouched near his brother with his own small direwolf, Shaggy Dog, prowling around. Bran was the first to notice Jon's arrival. He turned, eyes wide, and for a moment he was just a boy again, free of the heartbreak that must have filled Winterfell since Ned's absence. But then Jon registered the emptiness where Bran's mobility had been. He recalled the letters that had reached the wall. Bran's fall from the tower, his legs forever broken. It pained Jon to see him like this, but he forced a gentle smile. "Jon!" Bran breathed. He tried to stand, but his legs could not support him. Instead, Rickon, who had whirled around in surprise, jumped up. The younger boy gaped at Jon, tears gathering in his bright eyes. "Jon?" Rickon muttered, and for a moment, he looked as though he would fling himself into Jon's arms. But Rickon was still small, uncertain how to express the swirl of emotions. He held back, trembling. Jon walked forward, knelt, and pulled them both to him. The feeling of his brothers, their scent, the warmth of them, brought tears to his own eyes. He realized how close he had come to never seeing them again if he had taken the black. And yet, would that have been easier than returning here under such dire circumstances? "I'm here," Jon said, unsure what else to say. He stroked Rickon's hair, noticing how the boy had grown. Then he looked at Bran, whose gaze was serious, older than his years. "I'm sorry I was away for so long, but I'm back now, and I won't leave you." Bran's lips parted, and he nodded once. "Father, we haven't heard anything from him since the news of his arrest," Bran murmured. "Robb's gone to get him back. Will you help Robb? Are you staying here?" Jon swallowed. The question burned because he had no easy answer. "I mean to help," he said, "but I don't know yet what form that help will take. Until I figure it out, I'll see that Winterfell is safe if I can." Rickon clung to Jon's arm, pressing his face into Jon's furs. The tension in the Godswood weighed heavily on Jon's shoulders, but in that moment, he realized that even if he was a bastard by birth, these were still his siblings, just as much as any siblings could be. He would do what needed to be done to protect them. The old gods watched silently, the heart tree's red sap seeming to bleed in the pale bark. Jon closed his eyes, feeling the hush of that sacred place, letting it bolster his resolve. Over the next few days, Jon tried to settle into Winterfell, uncertain whether he was an intruder or a welcomed son. He checked in with Maester Luwin about the daily tasks of the castle, saw that the guards were drilling properly under Ser Roderick Castle's watchful eye, and dined with Bran and Rickon in the Great Hall. Though the castle was mostly subdued with so many men having marched south, some semblance of normalcy remained. The ravens came and went. The kitchens prepared hearty stews. Hodder wandered the corridors, bellowing that single word. The direwolves, Shaggy Dog, Summer, and Ghost roamed around, occasionally frightening the stable boys. Jon spent hours in the library, poring over maps of the Riverlands and the roads to King's Landing. He considered the paths the Northern Army might take. The knowledge set his blood on fire. He wanted to mount his horse and ride, to join Robb's host. And yet, every time he considered leaving, he saw Bran in his chair, looking out over the courtyard. He saw Rickon stumbling around with Shaggy Dog and how the boy's eyes would dart around whenever the war was mentioned, as if he feared Winterfell might vanish if he turned his back. Late one evening, as Jon sat in the solar with the little family that remained, Maester Luwin approached him quietly. "The ravens have brought news," he said, voice subdued. "Lord Eddard Stark has been executed in King's Landing." Jon felt as though an icy spear had gone through his chest. He froze, unable to breathe, unable to speak. The world seemed to tilt around him. Executed. He had been too late. Even if he had not taken the black, he had not reached King's Landing in time. In the swirling darkness of his thoughts, he remembered the day he'd left Winterfell for the Wall, how he'd said farewell to his father, the quiet pride in Ned Stark's eyes. That father was gone now, cut down by a boy king's cruelty or the queen's machinations. It didn't matter how. The outcome was the same. Bran made a small sound, half a gasp. Rickon let out a cry and fled the room, tears streaming down his cheeks. Jon wanted to follow him, to comfort him, but he could not move. He felt as if a part of him had died as well, and all that remained was a hollow vacuum swirling with rage. He locked eyes with Maester Luwin, whose own visage reflected sorrow. Jon eventually managed to stand, though his legs shook. Maester Luwin's gentle hand reached for his shoulder, but Jon stepped back, fists clenching. He needed to think, needed to do something, to lash out or to swear vengeance, to uphold all that Ned Stark had meant to him. He blinked back tears, refusing to let them fall. He was not a child. He was old enough to know the cost of war. But oh, the pain was great. He found himself in the gods wood not long after, kneeling by the pool, tears mingling with the cold water as he splashed his face. Ghost hovered protectively at his back. Jon stared at the weirwood's face, its carved eyes leaking red sap. The old gods gave no answer to his unspoken plea. But the wind through the branches whispered, and for the first time in his life, Jon felt a faint sense of belonging. Some intangible presence that told him his father's spirit lived on, that the North remembered. When the wave of grief receded, it left behind a sharper edge in Jon's heart, an edge that promised he would not let this wrongdoing go unpunished. A day passed. Jon scarcely slept. He was consumed with thoughts of vengeance, of riding south to find King Joffrey and put a sword through his black heart. Yet he also knew that Robb was now declared king in the north by the bannermen who had rallied. That meant the war was more than personal, it was for northern independence, for a rightful justice. Jon could not stand apart from it. On the second morning after he learned the news, Jon found Bran in the library. The boy was staring at a dusty volume about the kings of old, though he barely seemed to be reading. Summer lay at Bran's feet, ears perked. Jon knelt beside Bran's chair, gently placing a hand on his brother's arm. "I'm going," Jon said quietly. Bran glanced up, brow furrowed. "South." Jon nodded. "Robb will need every sword. And I need to—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I need to see justice done for father. I can't hide behind these walls while the man who killed him sits on the Iron Throne." Bran's eyes shone. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice choked off. He seemed older than his years in that moment. Finally, he whispered, "Then you must go." Jon nodded gravely. "You'll look after Rickon. The castle needs you. Our people need you both." He kissed Bran's brow, then turned away, not wanting to let him see the tears that threatened again. Bran had enough burdens. And so, Jon left the library, heading to the courtyard to prepare. Maester Luwin tried to talk him out of it, or at least to slow him down, but Jon refused to linger. Ser Roderick Castle, who had recently returned from a brief mission in the south, offered to accompany Jon with a small retinue, for Castle also intended to join Robb's forces once he ensured the safety of Winterfell. But it was decided that at least some men must remain to protect the castle. Jon insisted he could travel swiftly and quietly on his own, though he accepted a few volunteers, men who had been left behind by Robb but were itching to join the fight. Jon donned boiled leather and mail, the standard of House Stark on his breast. It was the first time he had worn such a sigil proudly. In truth, he was not a sworn Stark in the eyes of the realm, but at Winterfell no one questioned it. The day he rode out, the gates opened to him without hesitation. Bran and Rickon watched from the battlements, their figures small against the morning light. Jon raised a hand in farewell. He had promised them he would come back, if the gods allowed. Ghost loped beside his horse, a silent white shadow. They traveled south for many days, crossing the neck. The land seemed subdued in the face of war. Farmsteads deserted, villages quiet. Now and then, they encountered northern outriders, men wearing the direwolf sigil. Word spread that the young wolf was gathering victories and forging alliances, that the lords of the north were as fiercely united as in the days of King Torrhen Stark. But rumor also told of Tywin Lannister's armies prowling the riverlands. Smoke rose in the distance where battles had been fought. Jon felt an intense mixture of fear and purpose. By day, he pressed on with his small group. By night, he huddled by the campfire, speaking little, haunted by the memory of Ned's voice, by the hollow echo of the vow he never took. Sometimes he caught glimpses of a future he had never before imagined. If the North truly broke away and recognized Robb as king, where did that leave Jon Snow, the bastard? Did it matter so long as he fought for his father's memory and family's honor? Finally, they reached Riverrun. The banners of House Tully fluttered in the breeze, and the encampment around the castle sprawled in all directions. Jon's heart thumped as he guided his horse through the lines of tents, searching for Robb's standard. Soldiers called out. Some recognized the stark white wolf padding beside Jon, and a ripple of astonishment spread. "Is that Jon Stark?" some asked, for they knew him only as Ned Stark's bastard rumored to have joined the Night's Watch. Guided by a pair of guards, Jon soon found Robb's command tent. He dismounted, walked past the tent flaps, and there stood Robb Stark, his auburn hair grown longer, his features sharper with the burdens of war. When Robb's gray eyes fell upon Jon, a flurry of emotions crossed his face. Surprise, relief, and then an undercurrent of sorrow they both shared. "Jon," Robb asked softly, stepping forward. It was the first time Jon had seen him since the day the King's party left Winterfell all those moons ago. "What are you? You took the black. Did you desert?" Jon shook his head, closing the distance. He saw the new lines of care in Robb's expression and recognized that Robb was no longer merely the older brother he used to spar with in the courtyard. He was king in the north now, or so the lords had proclaimed. "I never took the vow," Jon said, voice low. "I left the wall before I said the words. I couldn't stand idle while father was in danger." Robb exhaled, nodding once, a flicker of gratitude warring with grief. "Then you're here to fight with me." Jon placed a hand over his heart. "I am." Robb's mouth tightened. He turned aside, motioned for Theon Greyjoy, who stood nearby, to give them some privacy, along with the few lords present. They exited the tent, and only Jon and Robb remained. For a moment, no words were spoken, just the weight of their father's death pressing on them. Then Robb gripped Jon's shoulder, and their eyes met, brimming with shared pain. "He's gone," Robb whispered. "They took his head, put it on a spike. Sansa, Arya, we don't even know where they are. They might be in King's Landing hostages." Jon's eyes closed briefly, his jaw flexing. He had heard rumors that Arya had escaped, that Sansa was engaged to that monster Joffrey, but he couldn't be certain. Fury churned inside him. "I want Joffrey's blood for this," he said, voice shaking. "I want to make him pay." Robb stared at him for a long moment. Jon could see the conflict in his brother's eyes. Robb, too, was torn between the role of a king and the heartbreak of a son. "So do I," Robb said at last. "And we will, but we have to be cunning. We face the Lannisters on many fronts. Tywin's armies, Jaime's capture. Our mother arranged Jaime's capture, but we need to ensure he stays that way. We have allies and foes all around. This war is bigger than we ever imagined. We must fight, but we must also plan." Jon nodded. "I understand." Robb's lips pressed into a thin line. I've been crowned king in the north. The lords demanded it when we learned father was executed by the Iron Throne. We'll not bow to Joffrey Baratheon. We will avenge father. You are my brother, Jon. Bastard or not, that doesn't matter to me. Will you stand with me as a Stark? Jon's breath caught in his chest. Was it even possible that he, a bastard, could openly be acknowledged as a Stark? Certainly not by law, but in the eyes of the northern men who might follow Robb anywhere? He thought of the words of House Stark. Winter is coming. They belong to him as much as to any trueborn child. Yes, Jon said simply. Robb took Jon's arm in a firm clasp. Then we fight together. From that day forward, Jon was at Robb's side, learning the ways of war from lords and knights who had known Ned Stark. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, accepted Ghost as a companion, and the two white-fanged wolves prowled the outskirts of the camp as if they knew that these men were their pack. Jon listened to the war councils, studied the maps, and trained with the men, showing them the skill he had honed at Castle Black. Some eyed him with skepticism at first. A boy who had nearly joined the Night's Watch and claimed to be a Stark. But as the days passed, he proved himself in small skirmishes, leading scouting parties, demonstrating discipline and ferocity in equal measure. Still, in the quiet moments, Jon struggled. Memories of Ned haunted him, and the knowledge that Sansa and Arya were either captives or missing gnawed at him. He found a sort of camaraderie with Theon Greyjoy, who understood what it meant to be a hostage or an outsider, though Theon's arrogance and occasional barbs about Jon's bastard birth annoyed him. At least, in Theon, Jon recognized someone who was not purely bound by tradition and name. They both had complicated relationships with House Stark. And yet, Jon mistrusted Theon's restlessness. The war raged on, battles flaring across the riverlands. Robb struck with cunning, outmaneuvering the Lannister forces at several key fords. Jon rode with a cavalry unit under the direction of Roose Bolton's men, though he found Bolton unsettling. At the Whispering Wood, they trapped Jaime Lannister and took him prisoner. The camp erupted in celebration, though Jon knew victory on the field was but a single step toward avenging Ned's death. Late one night, while the camp feasted, Jon slipped away to find quiet. He walked beside the red fork of the Trident, the moonlight silver on the rippling water, Ghost trotting silently behind him. The memory of Ned's warm voice as he taught Jon how to hold a sword for the first time weighed on his mind. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't hear the footsteps behind him. "Jon!" came Robb's voice softly. Jon turned to see his brother, wearing a cloak trimmed with wolf fur, the circlet of the king in the north gleaming on his brow. Grey Wind padded at Robb's side. The big direwolf sniffed at Ghost in greeting. "Robb." Jon inclined his head, though he felt awkward addressing Robb as king, even if that was what the rest of the northern lords did. Couldn't sleep? Robb let out a long breath, stepping up beside Jon to watch the moonlit water. "No, too much weighs on my mind. We have the Kingslayer, but that means every Lannister in the realm will be plotting to free him. Meanwhile, your sisters, our sisters, are in King's Landing, if Sansa is still betrothed to that monster. And Arya, we have no word of her. I think of Mother, who is working with our allies, and I dread what new dangers tomorrow's dawn will bring." Jon understood. "It's a heavy burden to be king," he said softly, "and a brother and a son all at once." Robb nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm too young for this. Father was always so sure of what was right, and now it's down to me to lead the North. I wish he were here." Jon swallowed hard. "So do I." They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the rustle of the wind in the trees. Then Robb turned to Jon, eyes earnest. "When this is done, when we make the Lannisters pay, when we free Sansa and Arya, when I've secured the North's independence, I want you to stand beside me, not just as my brother, but as Jon Stark, a true son of Ned Stark. Bastardy be damned. Father would want you recognized, I know it, and we have lords who might support that." Jon's breath caught. It was a possibility he had never dared hope for, to be legitimized, to bear the name Stark. He thought of the stories of bastards who were recognized. Ramsay Snow was rumored to have been legitimized by Roose Bolton. Princes had been legitimized in the past by royal decree. But it was no small thing. Would the lords accept it? Could the king in the north declare him a Stark? Perhaps. The realm was changing. I don't know if I deserve that, Jon said, voice thick with emotion. But I would be honored, Robb. Robb smiled faintly. We'll speak more of it in time. For now, we have war. Jon nodded. He reached out and gripped Robb's forearm. It was a gesture of brotherhood that needed no words. Then they parted, each lost in thought, each tethered to a shared resolve. The Lannisters would pay, and the North would remember. Within a fortnight, the northern host moved again, crossing deeper into the Riverlands. Jon took part in the Battle of the Camps, where Tywin Lannister's vanguard clashed with Robb's forces. The air was full of the sound of steel on steel and the screams of horses. Jon rode amid the chaos, Ghost darting alongside him, sowing terror among Lannister ranks. He slew men who wore the Lion Sigil, feeling no mercy. The cold rage he felt at his father's death guided his sword arm, and each strike resonated with the memory of Ned's honor. After the battle, they captured more Lannister knights. News arrived that the southern lords were in turmoil. Stannis Baratheon claimed the throne. Renly Baratheon claimed the throne. Joffrey Baratheon, though truly a child of incest, if rumors were to be believed, sat on the throne. Chaos reigned in the south, while in the north, Robb Stark's banner of the direwolf flew high. The king in the north had consolidated his hold over Moat Cailin, the Neck, and every road leading south. The question now was how best to free the girls in King's Landing. Jon yearned to storm the capital itself, to stand face to face with Joffrey and pay him back for Ned's death. But the War Council was more cautious. Lord Bolton argued for a push into the Westerlands to draw Tywin away from the capital. Lord Karstark still mourned the death of his sons at Jaime Lannister's hand and clamored for vengeance. Lady Catelyn Stark, who had rejoined them, urged diplomacy to see if Sansa and Arya could be ransomed in exchange for Jaime. Robb listened to them all, and Jon watched, quietly absorbing each perspective. One night, Robb called Jon into his command tent again, where Catelyn was standing beside a table covered in maps. She turned to Jon, her eyes betraying remnants of old resentment. He knew she had never truly accepted him, but also a grudging respect for the man he had become. "Jon," she greeted, her tone neutral. "Robb tells me you've acquitted yourself bravely in battle." Jon bowed his head. "My lady, I do my best." She pursed her lips, then looked at the maps. "We have a chance to trade the Kingslayer for Sansa and Arya, if we can broker a deal." Jon's heart pounded. The idea of exchanging Jaime Lannister for his sister's freedom was enticing. Yet he thought of the devastation the Kingslayer had wrought on their forces, of how valuable a captive Jaime was. "Are we certain Joffrey would honor any such exchange?" Jon asked. "He's proven himself sadistic and cruel." Lady Catelyn exhaled. "No, we're not certain, but Sansa is trapped in King's Landing. She's still betrothed to that boy, and we have no word on Arya. Possibly she's wandering the streets, or in the dungeons, or worse." A cold fear gripped Jon. The idea of Arya alone in the capital made him want to storm the city himself. But he also knew that a rash move could cost them dearly. He looked to Robb, who was silent. Robb leaned over the map, tracing roads that led to the capital. "They have the advantage of walls and the crown's resources. If we strike directly, we risk losing too many men. We've won battles, yes, but a siege on King's Landing with the Lannisters still strong in the field is folly. Our best chance is a hostage exchange, or at least the threat of it." Jon pressed his lips together. The fire in his belly demanded swift justice, but reason told him that war rarely allowed for such direct solutions. "What part do you want me to play?" he asked quietly. Robb straightened. "Mother thinks it might be wise to send an envoy to treat with the capital, or at least with one of the Lannisters close to the throne, maybe Tyrion Lannister, who is rumored to be somewhat more reasonable. If we do that, it should be someone who has a personal stake in retrieving Sansa and Arya, and whose presence will show we are serious. Someone with Stark blood." Jon's breath caught. "You want to send me to negotiate?" Lady Catelyn tensed, her eyes flickering between Robb and Jon. "I am uncertain," she said. Jon is untested in the ways of diplomacy, and we have reason to believe the Lannisters might take him captive just to bait Robb further. Robb's gaze rested on Jon. You have more reason than any to protect our sisters, but it's not a command. I'd never force you. The mission will be dangerous, possibly suicidal. Jon considered the risks. The idea of walking into the lion's den, so to speak, turned his stomach. But the memory of Sansa's calm smiles, Arya's mischievous grin, he couldn't bear the thought of them suffering. I will go, if it gives us a chance to bring them home, Jon said steadily. Catelyn studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You are braver than I gave you credit for, Jon Snow, but bravery alone won't see you through. You must be careful, cunning. The Lannisters know how to spin words as well as they wield swords. Their court is full of vipers. I understand, Jon replied. Whatever it takes. That night, Jon tried to sleep, but his mind whirled with the enormity of what lay ahead. Ghost sensed his unease, curling protectively at Jon's side. The next day, Robb and Lady Catelyn finalized the plan. Jon would ride under a flag of truce, bringing a small retinue. They would carry terms of negotiation and offer to exchange Jaime Lannister for the safe release of Sansa and Arya. It was a calculated risk. If Joffrey refused or took Jon prisoner, the war would grind on with even greater fury. But if it succeeded, they could at least ensure the girl's safety and possibly glean further advantage. Word spread quickly through the northern camp that Jon Snow, or Jon Stark as some were calling him now, would be the envoy. The men saluted him with respect, acknowledging that only one truly devoted to House Stark would dare walk into the jaws of the beast. Theon Greyjoy clapped him on the shoulder, half in admiration and half in pity. Watch your head, Snow, he said. Go near that blonde witch Cersei, and you might never come back with your manhood intact. Jon refrained from retorting. He had little energy for Theon's japes. Before he left, Jon met with Robb one last time in private. Robb grasped Jon's arm. If you do not return, I will ensure the Lannisters pay. Jon tried to smile, though his nerves were knotted. If I do not return, I'll be haunting them myself. They embraced, a fierce hug of brothers separated by circumstance but united in blood. Accompanied by a small escort of knights loyal to House Stark, as well as 2 trusted men from House Mormont, Jon set out eastward. They passed the devastation of the war in the Riverlands. Burned farms, displaced commoners, scattered corpses. The men with Jon urged him to use caution at every turn. They raised the white banners of truce where they went, hoping no Lannister patrol would cut them down before they reached the capital. It was a tense journey. Outside the gates of King's Landing, the watchers on the walls jeered at T.M. Eventually, the City Watch under the command of the newly entrenched Lannister power structure escorted Jon and his men inside. The air smelled of rot and sweat, the city crowded with fearful faces. Joffrey's reign had done nothing for peace. In the Red Keep they were made to wait. Hours passed in a dim antechamber, guards leering at them, until finally a messenger announced that the king would see Jon Snow. His men were to remain behind. Ghost was also to remain behind, but Jon put his foot down, refusing to be parted from his direwolf. The standoff ended when Tyrion Lannister appeared, raising an eyebrow at the enormous white beast. Let the wolf pass, Tyrion said, with a mix of amusement and caution. If this is to be a diplomatic discussion, let's not start by insulting our honored guest. Jon turned to regard Tyrion, remembering their brief encounter on the way to the wall. He had never disliked the dwarf, who had shown him a measure of empathy. Tyrion inclined his head politely. Jon Snow, unless I should address you by some grander title now? Jon squared his shoulders. Jon Snow is fine. I make no pretense. Tyrion nodded. Then follow me. The king is eager to hear your pleas. Jon's pulse thundered as Tyrion led him through corridors lined with gold cloaks. At last they entered the throne room. There, upon the Iron Throne, sat Joffrey Baratheon, his sneer twisting his boyish features. Queen Cersei stood at his side, looking regal and dangerous. Along the edges of the hall, courtiers and knights watched with thinly disguised interest. Jon forced himself to remain calm, to remember why he was here. Ghost padded beside him, teeth bared in a silent challenge to anyone who might threaten his master. A herald announced, "Jon Snow, envoy of King Robb Stark of the North." Joffrey let out a scornful laugh. "King Robb Stark, is it? The pup who calls himself a king. And his bastard brother has come to beg for his sisters? How quaint." Jon swallowed the burning anger that threatened to overflow. He bowed stiffly, though every part of him wanted to draw his sword. "I come under a flag of truce, your grace, to negotiate the release of my sisters, Sansa and Arya Stark." Joffrey smirked, glancing at Cersei. "Mother, this is the one who fled the wall. I'm told Ned Stark's bastard was meant to be a crow, but he's here now like a stray dog." Cersei's green eyes flicked to Jon appraisingly. "He's no deserter if he never took the vow, my dear son. But the point stands. He's turned up on our doorstep." Tyrion cleared his throat. "I believe Jon Snow has come with an offer." Jon forced a steady tone. "Robb Stark holds your brother, Jaime Lannister, as a prisoner of war. He offers an exchange. Ser Jaime's release for my sisters, safe and unharmed." A murmur traveled through the assembled courtiers. Some looked aghast at the idea. Others seemed to consider it. Joffrey's eyes flitted between curiosity and malice. "Why should I trade anything for those two girls? The older one is betrothed to me. She belongs here, does she not? And the younger one, if she's even alive." Jon's heart seized. "What do you mean, if she's even alive?" Cersei intervened with a smooth smile, though her eyes were cold. "Your sister Arya escaped the day your father was executed. She's not in our custody. As for Sansa, she remains under our protection, betrothed to the king. We have no reason to give her up." Jon fought the tremor in his voice. "You murdered her father. You call that protection?" Joffrey scowled. "Lord Eddard Stark was a traitor. You'd best keep a civil tongue in your head, bastard." Ghost let out a low growl that echoed in the great hall. A ripple of unease spread through the guards. Joffrey's eyes flickered with fear for a split second, but then his arrogance reasserted itself. "If that beast threatens me, I'll have it slain." Jon laid a calming hand on Ghost's neck. The direwolf stopped growling but kept his hackles raised. "I mean no threat here, your grace, but if you will not consider an exchange, then you give us no choice but to continue this war. Jaime Lannister's life is forfeit." Tyrion's gaze darted to Cersei. The queen's lips curved slightly, though there was tension in the corners of her eyes. "Killing Jaime would be unwise," she said coolly. "That would only deepen this conflict. Surely even your brother Robb sees that." Jon thought fast, glancing from face to face. He didn't trust any of them. He tried to keep his voice level. "If Sansa remains here, how do we know she's being treated well? Will you at least allow me to see her?" Joffrey rolled his eyes. "See her? Ha! As though you deserve a reward for coming here with demands." Tyrion cleared his throat again, pointedly. "Your grace, allowing him to see his sister could be seen as an act of good faith. It might at least delay your brother Robb from rash acts, such as harming the Kingslayer." Cersei's glare flickered over Tyrion, but she seemed to measure the benefits. "Very well," she said at last. "I will permit you a brief visit with Sansa, but it changes nothing of her betrothal status." She looked down at Jon, voice dripping with superiority. "Don't think to cause trouble, bastard, or you will see how quickly your wolf falls." Jon bit back a retort. "I want to ensure she is alive and well. That is all." Joffrey motioned impatiently to a Kingsguard knight, a tall man in white armor with a stern face. "Take him to see the girl. Tyrion, go with him if you like. Make sure he doesn't try anything." Jon inhaled shakily, bowing once more. At least he would see Sansa. Perhaps he could glean how she truly fared, and if there was any chance at rescuing her. He followed the Kingsguard knight, with Tyrion trailing behind, through labyrinthine corridors until they reached a door guarded by 2 gold cloaks. Inside was a small chamber, more comfortable than a cell but clearly a place of confinement. Sansa Stark was seated at a table, hands folded in her lap, her once bright eyes dull with sorrow. At the sight of Jon, she stood, her breath catching. "Jon," she whispered. Jon's heart twisted. He stepped forward slowly, ignoring the presence of the guards, and reached for her hands. Ghost sniffed around the room, then sat at Jon's feet. "Sansa," Jon breathed. "Are you all right? Have they harmed you?" She shook her head, but tears pooled. "No, not exactly. Joffrey, he treats me like his possession. I have to do everything he says. He shows me father's head on the walls, threatens me with it. He's so cruel. I just want to go home, Jon." Jon exhaled, hatred for Joffrey searing his insides. He squeezed her hands gently. "We're doing all we can. Robb has an army, and he will make them pay. But I came here to see if we could exchange you for their precious Kingslayer." Sansa's eyes widened. "Truly? They might let me go." Jon glanced at Tyrion, who stood quietly off to the side. Tyrion shrugged, his expression guarded. "That remains to be seen. My sister and nephew are not always reasonable, especially where family pride is concerned. But I, for one, have no desire to see more blood spilled." Sansa tightened her grip on Jon's hands, voice trembling. "You can't trust them. Even if they agree, Joffrey might change his mind on a whim. He enjoys hurting people." A shiver ran through her. Jon tried to keep his tone steady. "I'm not leaving King's Landing without ensuring your safety, Sansa. I promise." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I feel stronger just seeing you, but be careful. They could lock you up just as easily." At that, the Kingsguard stepped forward. "Time's up," he said, voice cold. Jon glanced around, searching for any immediate chance to whisk Sansa out, but the corridors and guards were too many. He wasn't foolish enough to draw steel here. That would only end in both their deaths. So he pressed a soft kiss to Sansa's forehead, ignoring the glowering guard. "Be brave. We're coming for you." Sansa nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Tell Robb, I'm still a Stark, no matter what they do." Jon had to turn away so he wouldn't break down. He left the room with Tyrion behind him, Ghost at his side. Tyrion guided him through the halls in silence until they emerged into a quieter courtyard. Tyrion paused, leaning on his cane, studying Jon with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. "You have a difficult road ahead, Jon Snow. King's Landing is a pit of snakes, and if your brother kills Jaime, you can be sure the Lannisters will answer in kind. If not to Sansa, then to someone else." Jon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want more bloodshed. I just want her safe. And Arya if she lives." Tyrion looked away, sorrow flickering in his mismatched eyes. "I'd help if I could, for my brother's sake and my own sense of decency. But my sister holds the real power here. And Joffrey is—" He shook his head. "Let's just say I'm not proud to call him my nephew." Jon forced himself to ask, "Is there truly no way to persuade her? If Robb releases Jaime, Sansa should be free to go. You know that's fair." Tyrion snorted. "Fair? Fair doesn't matter. Power matters. Cersei might trade Sansa for Jaime. She values Jaime above all else. But she'll demand terms that your brother might find unacceptable. She'll want the North's fealty or some other concession." Jon's heart sank. He knew Robb would never bend the knee now that the North had crowned him. The Lords would never allow it, not after Ned's execution. He could see how tangled this was. "Is there nothing we can do, then?" Tyrion pursed his lips. "I'll do what I can to soften their stance, if only to prevent further bloodshed. But I'm but one Lannister among many. My father wages war. My sister rules the court. My nephew is the king who thinks cruelty is the best display of power. Perhaps you might think of a private arrangement. Sneak the girl out. But that would be dangerous indeed, for everyone involved." Jon almost latched onto that idea, but then realized the near impossibility of it with Sansa so closely guarded. "So we're at an impasse." Tyrion inclined his head. So it would seem. If you leave King's Landing alive, let your brother know that I remain open to a more civilized solution, if one can be found. But I doubt my sister or nephew will be so inclined. Jon stared at the cobblestones, grappling with frustration and despair. But an ember of determination still burned in him. "I'll leave," he said at last. "Let Joffrey and Cersei make of that what they will. War will go on." Tyrion gave a short nod. "Farewell, Jon Snow. Be careful on your way out." Returning to the main courtyard of the Red Keep, Jon found the gold cloaks ready to escort him back to his retinue. King Joffrey was nowhere to be seen, which was a relief. Jon wanted nothing more than to strike the boy king down, but such an act would doom Sansa immediately. He and his escort left the city the next day, riding with hearts as heavy as lead. They took advantage of the same truce banners that had allowed them in, traveling swiftly until they reached the safety of the open road. At the Stark camp near Riverrun, Jon reported all he had learned to Robb and Catelyn. Fury followed the realization that the Lannisters would not release Sansa without immense concessions. Some lords argued they should simply kill Jaime. Others counseled that Sansa's life was too precious. Meanwhile, no word had come of Arya, fueling Jon's nightmares. "Your sister might be out there somewhere," Lady Catelyn said, voice choking with worry. "I pray the gods keep her safe. As for Sansa, we cannot risk a fool's dream. A rescue would be nearly impossible, and a trade would require us to give them what they want." Robb's face was grim. "We'll continue the war. I'll push deeper into Lannister territory, force their hand. If we threaten the seat of their power, maybe they'll relent." His gaze fell on Jon. "You did well, brother. I'm sorry you couldn't bring her home." Jon felt hollow. "I tried. If we keep pressing them, Sansa might be in more danger. But it seems the only way to gain any advantage." He walked out of the command tent, staring at the battered, muddy ground. Ghost followed, ears flattened. In Jon's mind, two images warred. Sansa's tearful face, trapped in the Red Keep, and Ned Stark's head upon the walls of the city. The vow he never took at Castle Black lingered in his memory. He had forsaken the Night's Watch, but would it truly matter in the end if he could not save his sister or avenge his father? He wondered if he had done the right thing in refusing that oath. Yet he looked around at the Northern Bannermen, men who had come south to defend House Stark, and realized that if he had remained at the Wall, he would have turned his back on all of this, on his family's need. Perhaps he could still make a difference. Perhaps the old gods had another path for him. In the days that followed, Jon took on more responsibilities in Robb's army. He led outriders, helped plan ambushes, scouted enemy movements. He saw how the men looked at him now, with a mixture of respect and loyalty. Some called him the White Wolf for Ghost's presence at his side. Others simply called him Stark, with an undercurrent of acceptance. There were battles won and lost. The Lannisters regrouped. Stannis Baratheon marched on King's Landing. The realm convulsed with chaos. Through it all, Jon fought for the North, for Ned's memory, for the chance to one day rescue Sansa and find Arya. He became a presence in Robb's councils, and though Lady Catelyn kept her distance, the tension between them eased somewhat as she saw Jon's devotion to her children and her cause. But nothing came easy in war. Betrayals simmered beneath the surface. Theon Greyjoy departed to seek an alliance with his father. The phrase muttered about a broken betrothal. Dark rumors reached them about the Boltons in the north, though no one could confirm. And all the while, winter continued its march closer. Amid this turmoil, word came of a massacre at Harrenhal, orchestrated by the Mountain and possibly aided by darker forces. Jon and a small band of men rode there under Robb's command to gather intelligence. They found only ash and death. That night, Jon slept poorly, dreams filled with swirling snow and the howling of wolves. He saw a throne of swords wreathed in ice, red eyes glowing in the darkness. He woke, heart pounding, hearing Ghost's low whine. He sensed something stirring beyond the War of the Five Kings, something older and far more terrifying. But he had chosen his path now. As the months pressed on, Jon gained a reputation among the northern men. He was more than Ned Stark's bastard. He was a wolf of the north, as fierce and driven as Robb. Some quietly spoke of whether Robb would legitimize him openly. Others whispered that if Robb died, perhaps Jon could claim leadership of the north, though that talk was quickly quashed. Jon ignored it. He only cared about winning the war, saving his sisters, and carrying on his father's legacy. Then came a day when Robb received summons from the twins. Walder Frey demanded that Robb hold to his promised marriage if he wished to maintain the Frey's loyalty. Lady Catelyn pressed Robb to keep his vow, remembering the precarious crossing they had needed months ago. Jon, wary of the Freys, advised caution, for Walder Frey was not a man to be trusted. The tension rose in the camp. Robb had fallen for another woman, they all knew, Jane Westerling. He wrestled with his conscience and the demands of the war. It was in this tumultuous atmosphere that Jon found himself riding alongside his brother's host once more, heading toward the twins to appease Walder Frey. The plan was to hold a grand feast and smooth things over, to cement alliances. But Jon could not shake an uneasy feeling. Ghost prowled restlessly at night, and Jon's dreams were haunted by forebodings of betrayal. In the gloom of one evening, as they neared the twins, Jon stood outside Robb's tent, looking at the distant silhouette of the massive crossing. Robb emerged, his expression grim. "We must tread carefully, Jon. Lord Walder is a proud man, and he's angry with me. I will do my best to salvage the alliance, but I fear what might happen if he won't be placated." Jon nodded, placing a hand on Robb's shoulder. "You're the king in the north. He owes you fealty. Remember that." A wan smile flickered on Robb's lips. But he might remember it differently. They shared a moment of brotherly understanding, a silent vow to protect each other if things went badly. Jon felt the chill in the air deepen, as if the old gods were warning him of a coming storm. But he steeled himself, for he had not forsaken the Black Oath just to cower at the first sign of danger. He would stand beside Robb, come what may. Thus the northern host arrived at the twins, welcomed with superficial courtesy by Walder Frey's brood. The halls were crowded, the tension palpable. Robb attempted to make amends, apologizing for breaking his betrothal. He offered new terms, new marriages, land, or money. Walder Frey's watery eyes regarded Robb with a calculating look. Meanwhile, the feast began, drums and music pounding through the hall. Jon, seated near the dais with Ghost lying at his feet, scanned the crowd warily. He saw Walder Frey's children and grandchildren moving through the throng, discreet glances passing between them. Roose Bolton was there, calm and inscrutable. Catelyn Stark was poised at Robb's side, her gaze flicking nervously around the hall. Then the doors slammed shut. The music changed. A chill rippled across Jon's skin. Walder Frey raised his hand, and the Frey men reached for hidden weapons. The so-called Red Wedding had begun. A wave of horror washed over Jon as Frey crossbowmen stepped out from behind columns and upper galleries, loosing bolts into the unsuspecting northern bannermen. Robb cried out as men around him fell. Catelyn screamed. Jon reacted instinctively, vaulting over the table. Ghost leapt at the nearest Frey, ripping out his throat before he could reload his crossbow. But there were too many. Shouts, screams, the metallic clash of steel echoed everywhere. Jon tried to force his way to Robb, cutting down a Frey soldier who blocked him, but more bolts flew. He saw Robb stagger, an arrow in his side. The king in the north fell to one knee, Grey Wind's distant howl of rage echoing from outside the castle. Catelyn seized Lord Walder's young wife at knife point, but Walder Frey only grinned cruelly, and more bolts flew. Jon's mind roared with desperation. He hurled himself forward, hacking at Frey men, taking a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. Pain flared, but he ignored it. He had to reach Robb. He glimpsed Roose Bolton striding across the carnage, wearing armor beneath his doublet. Bolton's eyes were cold. He said something to Robb. Jon could not make out the words, but then stabbed him in the heart. "No!" Jon bellowed, voice cracking with anguish. He tried to fight his way through the throng, but the press of Frey men was too great. He glimpsed Catelyn's face contorted in despair, a final scream on her lips before a Frey blade cut her down. Crossbows swung toward Jon. Ghost attacked mercilessly, but a spear found the direwolf's side, and Ghost howled in pain. Jon, tears streaming down his face, launched himself at the man who speared Ghost, cleaving him in half. Then more men rushed him, slashing, stabbing. He felt the hot burn of blades in his flesh, felt the warmth of his own blood. There were too many. The world spun. The last thing Jon saw was Robb Stark's lifeless bow. DY hitting the stone floor, the wolf fur cloak stained red. The clang of steel and the screams of the dying faded into a whir of oblivion. Jon thought of Ned, of Winterfell, of the oath he never said. Then darkness claimed him. He did not know how much time passed before consciousness flickered again. The pain was indescribable, his body riddled with wounds. He tasted blood. A coarse sack covered his face. He could barely breathe. Faintly he heard voices. A Fry voice, mocking. "He's still alive? He's a tough bastard. I'll give him that." Another voice, quieter, speculating on the value of Jon's survival. "He's Ned Stark's boy. Could be used against the North, or maybe the Lannisters will pay for him. Tie him up." Jon faded out again. When he came to once more, he felt movement. He was slung over a horse, tied hand and foot. Every jolt sent fresh agony through him. He tasted bile, felt the world tilt. He thought of Robb's final moments, the betrayal, the blood. They had lost. The war was lost. He had failed. Sansa was still captive, Arya missing. Bran and Rickon alone in Winterfell, or so he hoped. He thought of them, a pang of sorrow piercing his heart. He wasn't even certain if Ghost lived. Over the next few days, Jon drifted in and out of feverish delirium. The Freys had apparently decided to keep him alive, for now. Perhaps they meant to hand him over to Tywin Lannister or display him as a trophy. With each blurred day, Jon's wounds worsened, infection setting in. He coughed, vomited, sweat streaming down his face. Occasionally, a bucket of water was thrown on him, or a bit of stale bread tossed his way. He lacked the strength to do anything but cling to the flickering ember of life within him. In the darkness of his fever dreams, Jon saw Ned Stark standing at the edge of the Godswood pool. "You are a Stark of Winterfell," Ned said. "Rise." Then he saw Robb, crowned in fur, beckoning him onward, and Arya's voice whispered, "Not today." He felt the presence of Ghost, though he could not be sure if it was real. Eventually, the party stopped. Jon was dragged off the horse and thrown into a small cell. His arms and legs were unbound, but he could barely move them. The stench of his wounds made him gag. If he didn't get help soon, he would die here, nameless and alone. A bastard who had dared rise as a Stark lord. He closed his eyes, summoning the last bit of will he had. He refused to let the Freys or the Lannisters break him. Even if death was near, he would die as Jon Stark, son of Ned Stark, soldier of the North. He would not let them take that from him. He drew ragged breaths, mind drifting through memories of Winterfell's warm halls, of Bran's laughter, of Arya's fierce scowl, of Sansa's songs, of Robb's brotherly grin, and above all, Ned Stark's quiet pride. Darkness fell again, and he slipped into unconsciousness. As the blackness enveloped him, one last thought coalesced in his mind. Perhaps he had escaped one vow, only to be held to a harsher fate. Yet if given a chance to choose again, would he still refuse the Night's Watch oath to save his family? His father was gone. Robb was dead, Sansa captive, Arya lost, but he had fought for them with every ounce of his being. At least that, he told himself, was worth something. Outside, the world churned with the chaos of war and the approach of winter. But for Jon Snow, known to some as Jon Stark, all that remained in this dire moment was pain, the uncertain flicker of life, and the feeble hope that somewhere, the wolves of Winterfell still roamed free, waiting for the day their pack might be whole again or avenged. And so his story did not end with a black oath whispered beside a frozen weirwood. It ended, if it ended at all, in the darkness of Fry dungeons, waiting on the edge of life and death, a single spark of defiance glowing in his soul, the last echo of the wolf he had always been. Darkness seeped into Jon's dreams, shading them in feverish reds and blacks. He drifted in and out of consciousness with no sense of how many hours or days passed. The dungeon's damp chill sank into his bones, and his breath rattled in his chest. At times, he heard footsteps outside the cell door, heavy boots of fry guards or the shuffling of a servant bringing him water so foul it tasted of stagnant ponds. His wounds throbbed, half-congealed blood making his tattered garments stick to his flesh. His shoulder felt a fire from the crossbow bolt that had grazed him, and deeper cuts along his side oozed whenever he moved. He tried to focus on anything other than the pain. The memory of Winterfell's hot springs, the weirwood in the godswood, the encouraging words Robb used to share before a spar. But each time, the images twisted into the red wedding carnage. Fry crossbows firing from the shadows, Robb on his knees with an arrow lodged in his side, Roose Bolton's dagger flashing. Each time, Jon woke with a gasp, tears burning his eyes, the absolute horror of that betrayal consuming him all over again. Perhaps a merciful fate would have let him die on the spot. Instead, he was trapped in this nightmare, lying in filth, too weak to stand. Sometimes, in the swirling haze, he thought he felt warm fur pressed against him, the sound of Ghost's heartbeat, or the brush of the direwolf's muzzle. But when he opened his eyes, he found only the flickering torchlight of the passage, a scattering of stale hay, and the cold stone walls. Ghost was gone. Perhaps the phrase had killed him, or perhaps he had escaped, wounded but free somewhere beyond these walls. The only scrap of comfort Jon found was that possibility, that Ghost might still live. Direwolves were strong creatures. If Ghost still roamed, maybe he would find a way to help. One day or one night, Jon could no longer tell. A different set of footsteps approached. The cell door squeaked open. A pair of guards stepped inside, holding torches that made Jon wince. They were older men, one with a sagging jowl and narrow eyes, the other short and pot-bellied. They reeked of ale. Their watery gazes slid over Jon's slumped form with a mixture of scorn and curiosity. "Lord Walder wants to know if the bastard's still breathing," the sag-jowled one muttered. "Well, he's breathing. Smells like a dying dog, though." Jon glared weakly, lacking the strength to do more. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, then forced words through his cracked lips. "I'm alive," he rasped. "Tell Walder Frey that someday all of Westeros will know his treachery." The short guard barked a laugh. Big words from a pup in a cage. He prodded Jon's leg with a boot. Pain tore through Jon's side, but he gritted his teeth and refused to cry out. The guard smirked, turning away. "He's barely worth feeding, if you ask me." The sag-jowled one shrugged. "Lannister gold's as good as any, I suppose. Besides, might be Tywin wants to see this one in chains. Something about Ned Stark's brood and what remains of him. That's what the old man says, anyway." Jon's heart pounded with fresh fury. They intended to sell him to the Lannisters like a prize horse, or at least keep him as an asset. It made him wish he had died in the hall with Robb, fighting to the last breath. But he couldn't let despair take him. If he still lived, then perhaps there was a chance, however slim, that he could escape or find vengeance. Ned Stark's teachings whispered to him that a man must keep hope burning, even in the darkest of nights. The men left after tossing him a crust of stale bread. Jon crawled over the slimy stones, ignoring the agony in his abdomen, and gnawed the crust down with difficulty. He forced water down his throat. It tasted rancid, but it would keep him from dying of thirst. Then, spent, he slumped against the wall, eyes drooping as the torchlight outside dimmed. The knowledge that the phrase meant to hand him over to the Lannisters eventually lingered in his mind, neither comforting nor terrifying. He wondered if Sansa was still in King's Landing, or if Joffrey had done something monstrous to her in retaliation for the Red Wedding. He prayed not. He had no illusions, though. War had torn apart House Stark. Robb and Catelyn were dead, their banners scattered. Winterfell was left with only Bran and Rickon, boys who might not survive the chaos roiling across the north. His feverish dreams returned that night, a swirling tapestry of faces and voices. Sometimes he heard Arya shouting his name. Sometimes he glimpsed Theon Greyjoy with a savage grin. and other times he saw a tall figure in black armor with the visor up, no face beneath. Then came another presence, a silent figure with cold blue eyes, looming in a swirl of snow, a presence that made Jon's skin prickle with a fear more primal than war. He tried to wake but was trapped in the dream. A sharp voice cut through the imagery. "He is not the one. Leave him." When at last he tore free from that nightmare, he found himself bathed in sweat, his wounds throbbing more intensely than ever. The infection was spreading, and every ragged breath made him dizzy. The scraping of the cell's iron door signaled another visitor. This time, a single figure entered, carrying a flickering lantern. Jon blinked blearily, trying to make out details. The figure was a woman, short, gray-haired, with a sallow face and a mouth set in a grim line. She wore a plain brown dress, stained with the drippings of some stew. Her eyes flicked over Jon. Then she crouched beside him. She smelled of onions and old grease, but there was something gentler in her gaze than in the Fry guards. "Don't fuss," she muttered, pulling out a pouch of herbs and a water skin that smelled faintly of wine. "I ain't here to kill ye. Lord Walder's sworn me to keep ye alive, and that's that. I'm no maester, but I can do a bit of healing." Jon's throat was too dry to form a protest. He only winced as she pressed a damp rag to the wound on his shoulder and forced him to drink a bitter concoction. The taste made him gag, but she gripped his jaw with surprising strength, keeping his mouth open until he swallowed. Then she dabbed at the infection oozing from his side, her face pinched with disapproval. "These Freys, they don't know what it means to treat a prisoner decent like," she muttered under her breath. "I was a midwife once in Stonehenge. War came. Everything turned to ashes. Ended up here. A sorry place it is, but I do what I must." Jon managed a rasping "thank you." The stench of his rotting flesh was overwhelming, and each touch of her cloth was torture. But as she worked, applying salves, he felt a faint coolness that eased the throbbing. After a time, she unwrapped a bundle of bread and cheese. Real food, not stale scraps. She tore off small bits and helped him eat. At first, his stomach churned, but soon he found himself ravenous. "You're a strong one," the woman murmured, studying him as if he were some curious creature. "Don't know if I should pity ye or admire ye." He didn't have an answer. At length, she stood, gathering her things. Her face creased with something like sympathy. "I'll come again tomorrow if they let me. Best keep your tongue guarded, though. Some here don't want you lasting. One slip, they might do worse than starve you." Jon nodded faintly. When she left, locking the cell door behind her, the newly dressed wounds itched and stung, yet he felt marginally better. It was a fragile thread of hope, but a thread all the same. He slept again, though not deeply. When he roused, he tried to assess the condition of his body. The muscles in his legs cramped if he shifted the wrong way. The cut at his side burned, though less fiercely. The crossbow graze in his shoulder might have been on the mend. Perhaps in a few days he could walk. If an opportunity for escape arose, he had to be ready. Yet the days passed with agonizing slowness. The old woman returned a few times, smuggling small bits of food and reapplying her crude salves. Jon learned her name was Hilda. She spoke rarely of herself, mostly mumbling about the cruelty of the Freys. Even so, her presence was the only faint kindness in the gloom. Jon's chance to flee seemed non-existent. He was behind 2 locked doors, and the corridor outside was guarded by well-armed men. Weakened as he was, he'd never break out by force. His best hope might be that some outside force saved him, though who would that be now? The North's armies had been slaughtered at the Twins. House Stark's banner was in tatters. Perhaps the Blackfish, Bryn den Tully, still resisted somewhere, or the Brotherhood without banners roamed the riverlands. But placing faith in rumors was a pitiful shield against despair. At night, he practiced focusing on simple images to keep his mind sharp. The layout of Winterfell's courtyard, the stance to hold Longclaw when blocking a downward strike, the angles of a crossbow's arc. He repeated the names of his siblings, his father, his uncle Benjen. If he surrendered to apathy, he knew his spirit would break. He refused to let Walder Frey or Tywin Lannister have that satisfaction. One evening, Jon had lost track of how long he'd been in the dungeons. He awoke to an unusual commotion in the corridors above. Raised voices, the clatter of boots. He tensed, forcing his battered body upright. Soon enough, torchlight flickered outside, and the door to his cell creaked open. 2 guards stepped in, accompanied by a man in finer clothing. He had thinning gray hair and a long nose, his expression pinched with vague distaste. "You're to come with us," he said shortly. Jon's heart hammered. "Where are you taking me?" The man's smile was a grim slash across his face. "Lord Walder wishes a word. Better you walk than be dragged." Jon's legs felt like water, but he forced himself to stand. The movement sent a lance of pain through his side, and he had to lean against the wall to keep upright. The crossbow wound in his shoulder twinged, but the bandages Hilda had given him kept it from splitting open again. The 2 guards were big brutes with cudgels at their sides. They took an arm each, supporting him in a mockery of courtesy. Painful though it was, Jon walked out into the corridor, feeling a wave of nausea at the sudden brightness of the torches. They led him through twisting passages, past more cells, up a dank staircase. The air became slightly fresher. Then came another corridor that opened into a broad hall. It was not the same grand banquet hall where the Red Wedding had occurred. This one was smaller, likely an audience chamber used for lesser gatherings. Torch sconces lined the walls, and a long table stood at one end. Walder Frey perched there in a high-backed chair, his face as wrinkled and sour as a rotten apple. Several of his brood were arrayed around him. Sons, grandsons, daughters, all with that distinct look of watery eyes and pointed features. Crossbowmen stood in the corners, arrows already notched. No chances taken with Ned Stark's bastard. Walder Frey leaned forward, eyes roaming over Jon like he was inspecting a horse. "Gods, you look even uglier than last time I saw you. Thought you might have died in the interim." Jon said nothing, swallowing his hatred. He noticed that Roose Bolton was not present. Perhaps Bolton had already departed with his share of spoils for the north, or maybe he simply avoided Frey's presence. Jon felt a stab of fury remembering Bolton's treachery, but Walder Frey was no less culpable. "You summoned me," Jon said, voice rasping from disuse. "I," Frey said with a sneer, "will be shipping you off soon. Lord Tywin Lannister's men are on their way. Or rather, he's now the grandfather to the king, or was until the boy died." The old man's lips twisted in some macabre half-smirk. "Word travels slowly. Joffrey's dead, if you haven't heard. Poisoned at his own bloody wedding. Suits him, I say. The boy was mad. They're calling it the Purple Wedding." He gave a shrug, half amused. "But Tywin's still hand of the king, Tommen's king now, that little one. And we owe old Lord Tywin a debt. He wants you delivered to him. Seems you're valuable, if only for the Lannisters to make a show of your head." Jon's pulse thudded. Joffrey dead? He hadn't even known. Though part of him felt grim satisfaction at that news, an eye for an eye in some twisted sense. Another part worried for Sansa, left in the midst of that chaos. He wanted to ask about Sansa, but Walder Frey's malicious smile told him that no real information would be offered. Instead, Jon pressed on the one point he could. "If your plan is to send me to Tywin, why am I here in front of you? Because I'd like to see your face when I remind you that the Starks are finished," Frey said, eyes narrowing with triumph. "You'll be paraded through the streets, perhaps forced to kneel to that young King Tommen, or maybe they'll just kill you straight off. That's your future, boy." Jon spat a gob of bloody saliva onto the floor. The ache in his side throbbed, but he refused to show submission. "You murdered guests under your roof," he said. "You violated every sacred law of hospitality. The North remembers, even if it takes 1,000 years." Walder Frey's mouth curled in a sneer. "Your father's precious honor didn't help him keep his head, and your brother's sense of right and wrong earned him a knife to the heart. Hospitality laws? Fa, a means to an end, that's all. At my age, I don't much care for those old songs of courtesy. We do what we must to survive." Jon clenched his fists, trembling with rage. He wanted to grab a blade, bury it in the old man's chest, but the guards had pinned him on either side, and the crossbowmen stood ready. Frey's watery eyes gleamed with pleasure at Jon's fury. "Take him away," Walder Frey said with a dismissive wave. "Tend him so he doesn't die before the Lannisters see him. Then put him in chains and send him off with the next party riding south." The guards hauled Jon back out of the hall, but his mind churned with the new knowledge. Joffrey was dead. Tommen sat the Iron Throne. Tywin Lannister would still want to secure the realm and stamp out any last sparks of rebellion. That presumably included capturing or killing any surviving Stark loyalists. If the North was in chaos, Bolton in control, perhaps, or the Ironborn threatening the coast, how many still resisted? Did Lady Meage Mormont or Lord Wyman Manderly still keep faith with House Stark? Even if they did, they might never know Jon still lived. He was taken not back to his old cell but to a slightly larger one. The window slit high on the wall allowed in a shred of watery daylight. A straw pallet lay in a corner, better than cold stone. Perhaps Walder Frey wanted him to be seen in somewhat presentable shape upon delivery to Tywin. Jon lay on the pallet, panting from the exertion of simply walking there, fresh blood seeping through his bandage. That final surge of anger had drained what little energy he possessed. He sank into a half-sleep filled with swirling images. Sansa's tear-stained face, Arya's grin, Robb's lifeless eyes, Ned's voice calling him to be strong. Later, the door opened again. Hilda shuffled in with a bowl of broth and a fresh salve for his wounds. She pursed her lips as she examined the reopened cuts. "Damned phrase," she muttered. "Can't treat a prisoner with sense." She applied the salve with surprisingly gentle hands, then fed Jon a bit of broth. He managed to swallow a few spoonfuls. "They're sending me to Tywin Lannister," Jon croaked when he found the breath to speak. "To King's Landing, presumably." She nodded, her gray hair limp around her face. "So they say. Might be trouble on the roads, though. Heard rumors of outlaws prowling." She paused. Who's to say what might happen in transit? A flicker of possibility sparked in Jon's mind. If the roads were indeed plagued by outlaws, possibly the Brotherhood without banners or other renegades, there might be an opportunity to escape. Even so, it was slim, but at least it was something. He gave Hilda a long, searching look. "Would you help me?" he asked. "If there's a chance, I need to get away." Her expression clouded. She set the broth aside. "Boy, I owe you no special debt. If I aid you and get found out, they'd kill me. I'm sorry." Disappointment coiled in Jon's gut, but he couldn't blame her. "I understand." She hesitated. "I'll not speak of it if you try something, but don't expect me to fight your battles. That's all I can promise." It was more than he had any right to demand. Jon bowed his head in thanks, and she left, the door locked behind her. Over the next few days, Jon forced himself to heal as best he could, nibbling whatever she brought, doing what little exercise his shredded muscles allowed. He was still wretchedly weak, but at least he could walk a short distance now without collapsing. Time, though, was short. The Lannister escort might arrive any day. His chance came sooner than expected. 5 nights later, or was it 6? The corridor outside his cell erupted in shouts. Jon lifted his head from the pallet, heart pounding. He heard clashing steel, a strangled scream, and the dull thud of something heavy hitting the floor. Then came quieter footsteps. Jon's mind raced. Could it be some infiltration? A Frey dispute? In the gloom, the cell door squeaked open. A lantern's glow revealed Hilda, face grim, flanked by 2 men in dirty cloaks, swords in their hands. Behind them lay a Frey guard with a spreading pool of blood beneath him. Jon sat up, wincing. Ghost was not among them, to his regret, but from these men's posture, they were no Freys. They wore no house sigils. One had a missing ear, the other a ragged scar across his jaw. Hilda jerked her chin. "I told them you were worth saving, that maybe the North would thank them one day." Jon's eyes darted between the armed men. "Who are you?" The scarred one bared his teeth in a half-grin. "We're men of the Brotherhood without banners, sworn to protect the small folk in these war-torn lands. Word reached us that Walder Frey held a valuable prisoner. Once we learned it was a Stark, well, we decided to see if we could do a little good tonight. Jon's chest constricted with sudden hope and disbelief. Why would you risk so much for me? The man shrugged. Beric Dondarrion, Thuras of Mir our lot, we believe in fighting for the realm's common folk. The Freys are butchers, no better than the Mountain. If we can steal away one of their prized captives, we do so with glee. Hilda looked over her shoulder, anxious. We have to go now, or the guards will raise an alarm. Jon tried to stand. His side screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth. The missing ear man handed him a ragged cloak. You can't wear that fancy bandage in the open. Put this on, stay quiet, and we'll lead you out. We have a small boat waiting on the river below. Jon fumbled with the cloak, nearly collapsing at the wave of pain from his wounds. But with the men's help, he stayed upright. Hilda pressed a small leather pouch into his hands. Herbs and salves, best I have, she murmured. You'll still need a proper maester if you don't want that side rotting. Words failed Jon. In that moment, his gratitude was as profound as any he'd ever known. Thank you, he managed. The men led him through the corridors, extinguishing lanterns as they passed. Twice they had to dodge Frey patrols. Jon's heart hammered, certain that at any moment crossbows might skewer them. But the Brotherhood men moved with practiced stealth. At last they reached a postern door leading to a narrow stair descending the outer wall of the twins. The chill night air hit Jon's face, bracing but sweet compared to the dungeon stench. In the courtyard below, the scattered torches revealed a few Frey guards, none looking this way. They crept along the ramparts, then down a ladder that led to the riverside. A small rowboat bobbed in the dark water, manned by another hooded figure. Hurry! The hooded figure hissed. The missing ear man helped Jon into the boat, careful not to jostle his injuries too violently. Jon sank into the bottom, breathing raggedly as the scarred man followed. The third man took the oars. Hilda stood on the bank, hands clasped together, expression a mixture of relief and fear. You're coming? Jon asked her, almost hoping she would. The Freed or the Brotherhood might protect her if the Freys discovered her role in this. But she shook her head. My place is here. There are others who need me. The Freys won't know I helped. They'll think these outlaws slit the guard's throat and stole you. Best I stay. She gave him a final nod, then vanished into the night. The rowboat pushed off and the current took them downstream, away from the shadowy bulk of the twins. Jon closed his eyes, pressing a hand to his side, feeling fresh blood seeping through. The sear of the wound kept him conscious, if barely. After a while, the scarred man spoke in a low tone. We'll row as far as we can tonight, then hide you in a safe place to recover. Might even get you to Lady Stoneheart if the gods favor us. Jon's brow furrowed. Lady Stoneheart? He had never heard that name. He almost asked but lacked the energy. Pain spiked through him, and he drifted into a half-aware daze, lulled by the sound of water against the boat. Occasionally, he heard the men murmuring, "He's worse off than we thought. Needs real healing." They were heading deeper into the riverlands, maybe to meet the rest of their band. Jon clung to the faint knowledge that he was free of the Freys. That in itself felt miraculous. In the gray light of dawn, they came ashore at a spot where a dense copse of willow trees concealed a hidden camp. A handful of other outlaws emerged, wide-eyed at the sight of Ned Stark's bastard in such a state. They offered what aid they could, clean water, scraps of salted meat. One was a skinny youth with a scar across his scalp. Another was a woman with a short sword strapped to her belt. They discussed the next steps in hushed voices, glancing Jon's way as though they weren't sure how he would react to them. Finally, the skinny youth approached with a mix of excitement and concern. You're truly a Stark, aren't you? Jon nodded, though he could barely hold himself upright. Jon, Ned Stark was my father. The youth's eyes shone. I used to hear about Lord Stark's justice. The Targaryen king gave him a command to kill Ser Gregor once, or so they say. That was before the war turned everything upside down. Jon tried to recall the incident. He knew Ned had been Hand of the King briefly, but he had to close his eyes, the dizziness returning. He sank onto a bedroll someone had prepared. The woman with the short sword helped him lie down, checking his bandages. "We'll try to find a maester or a hedge healer. Lady Stoneheart will want to see him if he lives." She glanced at her comrades. "We can't risk traveling with him like this until he's stronger." Jon forced his eyes open. Who is Lady Stoneheart?" The group exchanged looks. The scarred man who'd rescued Jon cleared his throat. "Some say she's the Blackfish returned, or a spirit of vengeance. But we know the truth. She was once Lady Catelyn Stark." Jon froze, a flush of heat surging through his feverish body. "Catelyn, she's dead. I saw. They slit her throat. She died." The man nodded soberly. "Aye, she died. But the Lord of Light or some darker power brought her back. It's not life as you and I know it. She's changed, vengeful, cold as the grave. Yet she leads us on raids against those who betrayed House Stark, especially the Freys. She'll want to see you. It might bring some measure of humanity back to her cause." Shock and disbelief warred in Jon's aching head. Could Lady Catelyn truly be alive? Or something like it? He remembered ghost stories whispered at the wall, old tales of men brought back by red priests. A chill crawled over his skin. "How?" he croaked. "Why?" Another man piped up in a hushed tone. "They say Beric Dondarrion found her body in a river, days after the Red Wedding. Thuras of Myr was with him, and he worked his Lord of Light magic. But it wasn't like the times he'd resurrected Beric. She came back different, changed by the trauma of her death. Her face is half-rotted, her throat gaping. She can't speak so well, but she remembers the betrayal. She's vengeance incarnate, they say." Jon shuddered. He had loved Catelyn from a distance, but she had never returned that affection, never forgiven him for being the bastard that represented Ned's indiscretion. And now, she was an undead figure of wrath, leading outlaws to kill Freys. Could any good come of such a cursed existence? Still, a tiny ember of hope glowed in Jon's heart. If Lady Catelyn truly roamed the Riverlands, then not all of House Stark's spirit had been extinguished. Perhaps they could join forces, free Sansa from King's Landing, find Arya, and reclaim the North. Or maybe it was a fool's dream, yet it was more than he had possessed when rotting in that Frey dungeon. He spent the next several days in that outlaw camp, half delirious with fever while a hedge healer was summoned from a nearby village. The healer, a wiry, grizzled man with an air of quiet authority, treated Jon's wounds more thoroughly, draining the infection from his side, stitching the deeper cuts. He applied stinking poultices that made Jon want to retch. But gradually, the fever lessened, and Jon regained enough strength to sit up for more than a few minutes. The outlaws shared what they had: rough bread, salted fish, a bit of ale. They told him bits of news from around the realm. That Stannis Baratheon still held the wall against wildlings in the far north, that King Tommen's coronation had taken place quietly, with Tywin Lannister as the true power behind the throne, that the Ironborn were retreating from some territories but still held Moat Cailin in the north. Jon listened intently, trying to piece together the new shape of the world. House Bolton, Roose Bolton, had taken control of the north by dint of supporting the Red Wedding's betrayal. The outlaws spat whenever they spoke of Bolton, cursing his flayed man's sigil. Some said his bastard, Ramsay Snow, was even worse than the father. The Umbers were divided, some forced to bend the knee to Bolton, others rumored to resist. White Harbor's stance was uncertain. Lord Wyman Manderley was cunning, or so people said, but no one knew where his true loyalties lay. A fortnight passed. Jon could walk short distances on his own now, though he still tired quickly. The outlaws told him they planned to rendezvous with another group that moved under Lady Stoneheart's direct command. She and a band of sworn men were said to be operating closer to the Trident, capturing Frey convoys. The outlaws considered it their duty to bring Ned Stark's bastard to her attention, for better or worse. Jon was uneasy. He remembered Lady Catelyn's cold stares, her refusal to call him by name if she could avoid it. The thought of meeting her undead incarnation filled him with dread. Yet the alternative, wandering alone, wounded, and hunted by the Freys or Lannisters, seemed impossible. So he agreed to go with them. When the day came to move, the outlaws provided Jon with a decent horse, a rangy brown mare named Shale, along with a worn saddle and tack. He pulled himself into the saddle, biting back the groan that threatened to escape. His side still twinged, and a wave of dizziness made black spots dance in his vision. But once he settled, the pain dulled. A few of the outlaws rode with him, the rest walked or took another boat. The plan was to travel along the back roads, hidden trails known only to foresters and outlaws, and avoid main thoroughfares where Frey or Lannister patrols might pass. Their journey was a grim one. They passed burned-out villages, farmland gone to ruin, the stench of decaying corpses lingering where no one lived to bury the dead. Outside one such village, Jon glimpsed a pile of bones picked clean by crows. Some might have been the remains of Stark soldiers who had fled the Red Wedding and were cut down. Each sight made his stomach twist with rage and sorrow. Westeros was unraveling. The wave of war, followed by petty conflicts between newly ascendant lords, left nothing but devastation for the small folk. He wondered if Ned Stark had known how quickly honor could be drowned in blood and betrayal. They rarely encountered travelers. Once, they spotted a small merchant caravan on the horizon and concealed themselves until it passed, not wishing to risk a confrontation. Another time, they came across a handful of Frey soldiers patrolling a crumbling road. The outlaws ambushed them swiftly, taking the soldiers by surprise. Jon was not strong enough for a full fight, but he managed to unhorse one soldier with a quick slash of a borrowed sword. The outlaws overpowered the rest. When the Frey men lay dead, the outlaws stripped them of valuables, including a battered suit of leather armor that roughly fit Jon. He strapped the armor over his wounded shoulder, teeth clenched, hoping it might offer some protection in the future. They pressed on, crossing the Trident at a shallow ford by moonlight. On the far side, they followed the old stone markers that once guided travelers to Harrenhal, though no one in the group dared approach that cursed castle. At last, one evening, they reached a hidden camp among a tangle of weeping willows and thick briars. The watchers at the edge challenged them, and once the outlaws gave the correct password, "Justice for the Old," they were allowed entry. In the center of the camp stood a large pavilion made of patched green and brown cloth, blending into the surrounding foliage. Torches glowed dimly. Armed men and women prowled about, some with the battered sigils of houses that had once served the Tullis or the Starks, others with no sigil at all. As Jon dismounted, a hush spread among them. They recognized him, or at least they recognized his face as that of a Stark. Some seemed awed, others suspicious. A tall man in a tattered cloak strode forward, accompanied by a red-bearded fellow who might have been a priest of the Lord of Light once, if his patchy robes were any sign. Jon remembered the stories of Thuras of Myr who traveled with Beric Dondarrion, but these men were not Beric or Thuras. Rather, they seemed lesser members of that band. The tall man nodded to Jon. "You're the bastard of Winterfell." Jon inclined his head. "Jon Snow." He glanced around. They said Lady Catelyn Stark was here, or Lady Stoneheart. The man's face tightened. "She is, but do not expect the warmth of a mother. She is changed." Jon nodded, his stomach tightening. "I only hope she might speak with me. I want to help the North avenge Robb." The man gestured for Jon to follow. They led him toward the pavilion, stepping carefully around muddy patches. The outlaws parted like a living maze, some lighting the way with torches, faces eerily shadowed. At the pavilion's entrance, 2 guards brandished crossbows. They parted when they saw the tall man's signal. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of damp cloth and something darker, decay. A single torch flickered near the center pole. Figures huddled in the corners. And there, seated on a makeshift chair of driftwood, was Lady Stoneheart. Jon's breath caught in his chest. She wore a dark cloak with a hood partially concealing her face, but Jon could see her pale, sunken cheeks and the leathery skin around her eyes. The slash across her throat was a gruesome, puckered wound that had never healed. Her eyes burned with fury and sorrow. When Jon entered, those eyes fixed on him. Even though he had prepared himself, the sight of her made his heart slam against his ribs. He spoke softly. "Lady Catelyn." A sound like a hiss escaped her mouth, as though she tried to speak but no words could form. One skeletal hand reached up, half hidden by the tattered sleeve, and pulled back the hood a fraction more, revealing the full horror of her scars. Jon clenched his jaw, straining not to recoil. He reminded himself that once, this woman had been his father's wife, the mother to his half-siblings. She might not have loved him, but he had never wished her harm. Now, she was an avenging spirit, perched between life and death. "She's recognized you," said the tall man. "When she chooses to speak, she does so in broken whispers. But mostly we interpret her signals." He looked to Lady Stoneheart, searching her mutilated face. "He is Jon Snow, the king in the North's half-brother, my lady. We rescued him from the frays." A rasping sound emerged from Lady Stoneheart's throat, a wet, hollow noise. She lifted a shaky hand and pointed at Jon. The red-bearded outlaw, some kind of interpreter perhaps, stepped closer, leaning in as though to hear something no one else could. Then he turned to Jon. "She wants to see your face more clearly." Jon stepped forward into the torchlight, letting it illuminate the bruises, the bandages. He knew how ragged he must look. His hair was a tangled mess, his eyes sunken from fever, his clothes dirty and blood-stained. Still, he held himself as tall as he could manage. She stared, her eyes flicking over him like a hawk's might over prey. After a tense pause, Lady Stoneheart raised her right hand again, beckoning. The red-bearded man produced a strip of parchment and charcoal. With effort, Lady Stoneheart scrawled something. Her writing was jagged, shaky. She held it out to be read. The man peered at it in the torchlight, then read aloud, voice trembling slightly. "He is Ned's bastard. He let my boy die." Jon felt his stomach flip. I had no power at the twins. I was in the Night's Watch, or nearly. I came south to help. I fought for him, tried to save him. He died before my eyes, my lady." The memories clamped on his heart. "I could do nothing." Lady Stoneheart let out a ragged exhalation, eyes burning like embers. She scrawled again on the parchment, each movement of her hand trembling with rage. The man read the new words. "You were not at the twins. You did not wed your sword to his side. You left him alone. You are a deserter." Jon trembled, tears threatening. "No, I deserted only the watch. I refused to swear my vows because I heard father was in danger. By the time I reached Robb, father was gone. But I fought for Robb in many battles. I was there at the Red Wedding. I saw him fall. I was stabbed and left for dead. I would have died if not for the Brotherhood. My lady, I have done all I could." She stared at him with an intensity that seemed almost inhuman. Her torn throat worked soundlessly, as though she tried to speak 1,000 accusations she couldn't voice. Then, slowly, she reached out a hand. Her nails were cracked, caked with dirt. She gripped Jon's wrist with surprising strength, dragging him closer. He almost stumbled into her lap but steadied himself. Her eyes were full of fury and anguish. Jon couldn't breathe under that gaze. He forced himself to speak gently, as he might with a wounded animal. "I grieve, my lady, for Robb, for father, for everything that's happened to House Stark. I wish I could have done more, but I'm here now. I want to avenge our family. I want to save Sansa, if she can be saved, and Arya if she lives." His voice cracked. "Let me help you. Don't cast me aside. We have the same enemies." A wet rattle came from Lady Stoneheart's ruined throat. She released Jon's wrist and snatched the parchment again, scribbling with furious strokes that ripped the paper in places. The interpreter read in halting syllables. "Words are wind. Let him prove it." Jon swallowed. "How? Tell me what you want me to do." Lady Stoneheart lifted a hand to the torchlight, letting its glow flicker over the deep red scar that slashed her throat. Then she made a slow, deliberate motion across her own neck, as though reenacting the moment it was cut. The message was clear: vengeance. Blood for blood. The tall man cleared his throat, gaze sliding to Jon. "She says that Walder Frey's kin must die. If you are truly loyal, if you truly wish to avenge Robb, you must show it in action, not words." Jon nodded, though his mouth felt dry as dust. "I swear it. I want that as much as she does. But it's not only Walder Frey, Roose Bolton shares the blame, and the Lannisters too. Joffrey may be dead, but Tywin is not. The realm still hunts any living Stark." The tall man responded quietly, "We take them one at a time. For now, Lady Stoneheart hunts the Freys in these parts. We set traps, ambush their supply lines, exact our toll in blood. She demands you join the raids, kill them yourself. Only then will she believe in your loyalty." Jon thought of his weakened state, his half-healed wounds. Could he ride into battle so soon? The ache in his side flared in protest. But looking into Lady Stoneheart's hollow face, he knew there was no refusal here. She was the one holding this band together, the one who had spared him from immediate suspicion. If he balked, she might condemn him as a traitor. And, if he was honest with himself, he felt that savage fury in his bones too. The Freys had butchered his brother, his mother, and much of the northern host under the sacred protection of guest right. He wanted them to pay. "I'll do it," Jon said, his voice steady. "I will fight, though I'm not yet fully healed. Every Frey who stands in our way, I'll kill them without mercy." A gleam lit Lady Stoneheart's eyes, as if some small measure of satisfaction stirred behind that ghastly mask of death. She nodded, an abrupt, jerky motion, then sank back into her seat, letting her hood fall forward. A rasping sound, half sigh, half snarl, emerged from her. The tall man beckoned Jon away, indicating that the audience was over. Outside, the night air felt cold against Jon's clammy skin. He breathed deeply, leaning on a wooden post to steady himself. The outlaws who'd accompanied him lingered. They seemed relieved that Lady Stoneheart had accepted him, but a few still watched him warily. Perhaps they guessed the complex history between him and Catelyn Stark. Perhaps they simply distrusted any newcomer. Regardless, for the moment he was part of their band. In the following days, Jon took up a place among them. He was assigned to a small group led by the scarred man who'd helped rescue him from the twins. They ranged through the riverlands at night, setting ambushes on roads that Frey supply wagons traveled. Jon's wounds remained tender, but each day he grew stronger, more capable of riding, shooting a bow, swinging a sword. The outlaws had meager provisions, but they shared everything, and the hedge healer kept a watchful eye on Jon's healing progress. His first raid came under a half-moon, when word reached them that 5 Frey men with a pack-horse and a cart of grain were heading to a minor stronghold. Jon's group formed a line across a narrow forest track. The Freys approached, their torches bobbing in the dark. At a signal, the outlaws unleashed arrows. 2 Freys dropped before they even knew what was happening. The others tried to flee, but the outlaws closed in. One man fell with an arrow in his thigh, howling. The scarred man turned to Jon, nodding grimly. Jon drew his borrowed sword, chest tight. He remembered the vow he had made to Lady Stoneheart. Once, he might have tried to take them prisoner, but the memory of the Red Wedding and the sight of Robb's arrow-pierced form filled him with a cold resolve. He advanced on the wounded Frey soldier, who looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Mercy!" the man gasped, half delirious. The outlaws made no move to intervene. This was Jon's moment to prove where he stood. Jon hesitated only a second. Then he drove the point of his sword through the man's heart. The Frey died with a choking sound. Jon drew back, feeling a tremor in his hands but no regret in his heart. He had killed men in battle before, but never one so helpless. This was war of a different flavor, vengeance, plain and brutal. It was savage, but so were the times they lived in. He wiped the blood off on the grass, eyes distant. From that night on, he earned a measure of respect within the Brotherhood's ranks. They called him the White Wolf, for the dire wolf that once followed him, though Ghost's fate remained unknown. Jon felt a pang of guilt about that. He hoped Ghost had escaped, maybe roaming the forests in search of him. On nights when Jon couldn't sleep, he'd stare into the darkness and swear he could hear faint howls. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking. Time blurred. The outlaws moved often, shifting camp every few nights to evade Frey patrols. On each raid, Jon's presence became more integral. He was a skilled rider and swordsman, and though he lacked the unstoppable vigor he'd had before the Red Wedding, his health improved steadily. The men whispered that the bastard of Winterfell was truly unstoppable, returning from the brink of death to wreak havoc on traitors. Jon didn't feel unstoppable. He felt hollow, fueled by anger and the memory of everything he'd lost. He caught only glimpses of Lady Stoneheart as she flitted between hidden camps. She rarely ventured out in daylight, as if the sun were her enemy now. Reports came in of successful ambushes and brutal reprisals. Frey men hung from trees along the riverbanks, sometimes with signs reading guest right pinned to their chests. The stories spread across the riverlands. A specter in the shape of Catelyn Stark leading a legion of ghosts to punish the faithless. And always that specter demanded more blood. Eventually, Lady Stoneheart summoned Jon again. This time, it was near midnight in a half-ruined tower deep in the woods. Rain battered the stones, water dripping through collapsed roof tiles. She stood in the gloom, hunched, one hand resting on a makeshift table. The tall man who served as her voice beckoned Jon close. She's heard rumors that a Frey knight, Ser Ryman Frey, leads a small host traveling north to Harrenhal. He's the old lord's grandson, Walder's bastard of a lineage tree. He's a foul sort, known for tormenting peasants. Lady Stoneheart wants him dead. She's sending you with a small force to see it done. Jon swallowed. How many men does Ser Ryman have? 30, perhaps. Enough to be cautious about. But you'll have the advantage of surprise, if you pick your ground well. Jon nodded. He understood what was being asked. Find Ser Ryman, kill him, kill his men, no survivors. Lady Stoneheart's eyes glistened with a baleful light. Her mouth twitched as though she wanted to speak but could not. She scratched a symbol into the dusty tabletop with a knife's tip, a crudely drawn wolf's head. Then she pointed at Jon, then at the wolf's head, as if to say, "We are the wolves of House Stark." He placed a fist over his heart. "I will do what must be done." The weight of that vow pressed on him. With every Frey he killed, he drifted further from the boy who had once yearned to be honorable like Ned Stark. But perhaps in times like these, vengeance was the only path left. By dawn the next day, Jon was in the saddle again, leading a group of 15 outlaws, including the scarred man and the red-bearded one. They scouted the roads Ser Ryman might take, eventually finding fresh hoofprints in a muddy track that led through a wooded hollow. Under the thick canopy, the air was cool and damp, and the ground was riddled with gnarled roots. Jon directed the outlaws to spread out and hide among the undergrowth, bows at the ready. They waited. The sun rose higher, birds calling overhead. Jon tried to keep his mind sharp, ignoring the ache in his side. This was the largest group of enemies they had faced yet, and he would have to lead the attack. A flicker of doubt passed through him. Would Ned Stark approve of such an ambush, an outright slaughter? But Ned was gone, and the world was different now. Jon exhaled, focusing on the rustle of leaves. Near midday, the sound of horses reached them. Peering through the foliage, Jon glimpsed the column. A few knights on fine mounts, followed by men-at-arms and pack-horses. At the front rode a stout man in gaudy armor, the twin towers of House Frey on his shield. Ser Ryman. He wore a sneer that suggested he was complaining about the damp road. He had about 30 men, as expected, some bearing crossbows, others swords and spears. Jon raised a hand in silent command. The outlaws notched arrows, hearts pounding. Closer, closer the phrase came, their horses plodding. At the perfect moment, when the vanguard was just below them and the rearguard had yet to reach the hollow, Jon dropped his hand, unleashing the ambush. Arrows hissed through the trees. The Frey knights cursed, one toppling from his saddle as a shaft buried itself in his throat. Another arrow clipped Ser Ryman's shoulder, spinning him sideways on his horse. Men shouted, trying to form a shield wall, but confusion reigned as the outlaws emerged from cover. some continuing to fire arrows, others leaping down to engage with sword and dagger. Jon spurred his mare forward. He drew his sword, charging at the cluster of Frey men grappling with two of the outlaws. The freed men had the advantage of surprise but were outnumbered. Jon's blade slashed across a man's arm, knocking him back before driving the point into another's chest. Blood sprayed in the chaos. Horses reared, screaming. He heard the scarred man roaring nearby, cutting down a Frey crossbowman. Ser Ryman regained his seat, brandishing a sword, bellowing for his men to rally. He spurred his mount forward, nearly running Jon down. Jon twisted aside, swiping at the horse's flank, but Ser Ryman parried. The clang of steel rang in Jon's ears. Ryman was a big man, but slow in his movements. Jon feinted low, then slashed high, catching Ryman's sword arm. The Frey knight snarled, blood matting his chainmail. "Stark bastard," Ser Ryman spat. "You'll die like your traitor brother." Jon felt cold fury bloom. He pressed the attack, ignoring the burn in his side. The ring of steel on steel reverberated through the hollow, and the acrid smell of sweat and iron filled the air. Finally, Jon found an opening. He pivoted to the right, ramming his sword through Ser Ryman's exposed flank. The Frey knight gasped, eyes bulging, and slumped in the saddle. Jon wrenched his blade free with a sickening sound. The knight toppled off his horse. Chaos still raged around them, but the sight of Ser Ryman's downfall broke the Frey men's resolve. Some threw down their arms, hoping for mercy. The outlaws offered none. They cut them down as Lady Stoneheart would have demanded. Jon, panting heavily, watched with grim detachment. The last time he'd fought so fiercely was at the Red Wedding, a losing battle. Now he was on the winning side, but it felt hollow. The outlaws cheered, satisfied in their vengeance. Jon looked at Ser Ryman's corpse, remembering the man's gurgling final breath. He stumbled away, leaning against a tree. Blood trickled from beneath his armor. One of the Freys had scored a shallow cut on his thigh. It was not serious, but enough to set his nerves aflame. The scarred man approached, wiping blood from his blade on a rag. "You did well, Snow. Lady Stoneheart will be pleased." Jon nodded, breathing ragged. "We should search their supplies, see if they carry anything useful." They did so, rifling through packs and saddlebags. Mostly food, some coins, spare arms. The outlaws took it all, discarding Frey heraldry in the muddy road. The corpses would remain, a grim warning to any who passed. Some among the outlaws were already talking of where to ambush next. Jon realized how fully this had become his life. Raiding, killing, surviving on scraps. But at least it was a purpose, twisted though it might be. They returned to Lady Stoneheart's camp victorious. When she beheld Ser Ryman's severed head, a grotesque trophy that the scarred man presented, she let out a long, rasping breath. Perhaps it was laughter or tears or both. She beckoned Jon forward and placed a cold hand on his cheek. He suppressed a shudder at the clammy feel of her dead flesh. Then she pressed her forehead against his, as if in some intimate, wordless communion. Jon stood still, uncertain, but he felt the rawness of her grief, the echo of a mother's love for her murdered son. For a heartbeat, he sensed a flicker of genuine sorrow rather than blind hate. Then she pulled away, covering her face with the hood. She gestured for the men to remove the severed head from her sight, apparently done with it. The tall man approached Jon. "She is pleased. You've proven yourself. Now, she would know your desire, if you still hold any wish beyond revenge. Will you remain here forever, hunting Freys? Or do you wish to seek out your sister in King's Landing, if she's there still?" Jon's heart hammered. He recalled the vow he'd made to Sansa, that he would not abandon her. Yet the chance of rescuing her from the Lannisters, especially with Tywin still in power, seemed slim, especially without an army. But maybe the Hound rumor was true that Arya roamed the wilds, or maybe Sansa had escaped in the chaos after Joffrey's death. He had no certain leads. And what of the north? Bolton held Winterfell, but perhaps Bran and Rickon were still there, in hiding or captive. A swirl of possibilities confused him. At length, Jon spoke, voice trembling with pent-up longing. "I must try to save what remains of my family. Sansa, Arya, even Bran and Rickon if they live. The North is lost to me now with Bolton in control. I can't reclaim it alone. But I cannot abandon my siblings." The tall man nodded. "Some of us will remain here to fight the Freys, but we can spare a few to accompany you if you choose to travel to the Vale or the capital. Lady Stoneheart will permit it now that you've proven yourself. She might even expect you to deliver her vengeance wherever you go." Jon looked at Lady Stoneheart. Her shadowed eyes stared back, emptiness and rage intertwined. He realized that, in her own way, she wanted him gone. He was a reminder of Ned's infidelity, and maybe also a reminder of the boy she'd lost. Yet her vengeance demanded that the Stark name continue to punish its foes. If he could strike at the Boltons, the Lannisters, any enemy, she would see it as further retribution. He bowed. "I will carry on the fight for House Stark, no matter where it leads me." He hesitated, then added softly, "For Robb. And for you, my lady." Her mouth twisted. Perhaps she tried to smile, but it was a terrible sight, a mere contortion of dead flesh. She half lifted a hand in farewell, then let it drop. Jon took that as dismissal. Outside, the night breeze carried the scent of pine and damp leaves. The outlaws congratulated him, offering skins of ale to celebrate the victory. Jon sipped only a little, for his soul felt heavy. He sat under a gnarled oak, gazing at the stars flickering between the clouds. Had he chosen well, to refuse the Night's Watch oath and walk this bloody path? Ned Stark had always taught him that a man's choices defined him more than his birth. But so far, Jon's choices had led him to betrayal, war, and the service of a vengeful wraith. And yet, he told himself, the alternative was to do nothing while his family died or scattered to the winds. Eventually, the tall man joined him, squatting by the tree. "I can gather 2 or 3 of my best fighters if you mean to travel south. The roads get more dangerous every day. Lannister patrols, bandits, sellswords. The war may be winding down in the eyes of lords, but for the common folk, it's never ended." Jon nodded. "I'd be grateful." He paused, weighing the options. "I might try to reach the Vale first. My aunt, Lisa Arryn, though I've never met her, is a Tully by birth. Perhaps she would help me find Sansa or at least shelter me long enough to plan. If Sansa is indeed still in King's Landing, I'll go there next. Or I might attempt to contact allies in the north. I don't know." The man shrugged. "We'll see what roads are open. For now, rest. You'll need your strength." Jon took a long breath, eyes turning back to the sky. The North Star gleamed faintly among the clouds, and for a moment, he felt a pang of longing for Winterfell's wind-swept ramparts. He clenched his fists, remembering how he had found a home of sorts in the Night's Watch, if only because he thought he had no future in the outside world. But now, that oath was forever lost to him, replaced by a new vow of blood and vengeance. How many more would die on this path? He pushed the thought aside, too weary to wrestle with it. Days later, he and 3 outlaws departed Lady Stoneheart's camp at first light. She did not come to see him off, but the tall man relayed a final message scribbled by her trembling hand. "Strike them all down. Remember the Red Wedding." Jon tucked the scrap of parchment into his pouch. He would remember, even if it haunted him until his last breath. They rode east, slipping through hidden byways, heading toward the Vale with the slender hope of Lisa Arryn's cooperation. The mountains loomed in the distance. As they traveled, rumors reached them. Tywin Lannister, the mighty hand of the king, was dead, slain on the privy by his own son, Tyrion Lannister, who had fled the city. The realm was in upheaval once more. King Tommen was but a boy, the Tyrells growing in influence, Cersei perched like a wounded lioness in the Red Keep. Sansa's name was whispered in connection to the death of Joffrey, though it was unclear if she had truly played a part. Some said she had vanished from the capital. Jon seized on that last rumor. If Sansa was gone from King's Landing, where had she gone? Could she be in the Vale already, under the protection of her aunt? It might be the best news he could hope for. He prodded his horse onward, ignoring the stab of pain in his healing side. A small flame of hope flared inside him, tempered by the knowledge that even if he found Sansa, the war for House Stark was far from over. Yet, in the quiet hush of dawn one morning, while they camped beside a narrow mountain trail, Jon woke to the sound of howling. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, but it came again, low, mournful, echoing through the crags. He rose, ignoring his protesting wounds, stepping away from the sleeping outlaws. Pale light bathed the rocky slopes, and in the distance, upon a ridge crowned with pine trees, stood a white wolf with its muzzle raised to the sky. Jon's heart skipped. "Ghost!" he whispered, voice catching. The wolf turned, its red eyes seeming to glow. Then it bounded away, disappearing beyond the ridge. Jon felt tears burn his eyes, relief and longing melding into a fierce ache. Ghost was alive, had followed him somehow through the riverlands and into the edges of the Vale. Or perhaps this was a vision conjured by his own battered spirit. But he believed it was real. In that moment, he felt the presence of the old gods, the threads of fate that bound him to that dire wolf, to the north and to the name Stark, even if it was not truly his by birth. He pressed a hand over his heart, feeling it pound. He whispered into the dawn, "I'm coming, Ghost. I'm coming for all of us." Then he turned back to the camp, aware that the road before him was long and uncertain. But he would walk it step by step, sword in hand, teeth bared like a wolf in winter. Honor was lost in the blood and betrayal of war, but family, the pack, remained. And that, he told himself, would be reason enough to keep fighting, no matter how dark the path became.